The morning I signed the papers on my house in Asheville, I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on the back porch, and listened to the Blue Ridge Mountains do absolutely nothing. No drama, no voices, no one telling me I was being difficult. Just the birds and the wind, and 63 years of hard living finally coming to rest. I had bought a 4-bedroom craftsman on 3 acres outside of town. Paid cash, which still made me smile every time I thought about it. The kind of smile that takes a while to arrive. The kind that means something. 5 years before, I was sleeping on a pull-out couch in my buddy Conrad's basement in Knoxville, eating gas station sandwiches, trying to figure out what a man does when his own son looks him in the eye and says, "You're an embarrassment." But we'll get to that. I want you to understand something first. I am not a man who came from money. My father worked the line at a textile mill in Spartanburg, South Carolina, until his back gave out, and then he worked it some more. I grew up eating pinto beans 4 nights a week and considering it a blessing. I put myself through 2 years of community college, got my contractor's license, and spent the next 30 years building other people's houses. Custom homes, mostly. Nice ones. The kind with cathedral ceilings and wraparound porches and master baths that cost more than my childhood home. I was good at it. Not just at swinging a hammer. I understood people. I knew when a client said I want something modern, that they meant I want my neighbors to be jealous. I knew when a couple fought in front of me during a walkthrough, that the marriage wasn't going to survive the build. You spend enough time in people's homes, you learn to read them. My son Theo never understood that. He thought I was just a contractor. Just a guy with calloused hands and sawdust on his boots. His mother and I divorced when Theo was 11. It wasn't dramatic, more like 2 people who'd run out of things to say to each other. We stayed civil for his sake. She moved to Phoenix. I stayed in Knoxville. Theo bounced between us through high school, and I did my best. I coached his little league team. I showed up to every school play even when they were boring, which they almost always were. I taught him to change his own oil, to shake a man's hand firmly, to tell the truth even when it cost you something. Then he met Serena. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me. Serena wasn't evil from the start. She was just the kind of woman who needed to be the most important thing in every room. She was smart, no question. She had an MBA from Wake Forest and a job at a commercial real estate firm in Charlotte. And she was pretty in a sharp, deliberate way. Like she'd decided exactly how she wanted to look and worked at it. The trouble started small. Theo stopped calling as often. He missed the Thanksgiving. Then Christmas. He started using words that weren't his words. Phrases about healthy boundaries and moving forward and not being held back by other people's energy. I remember the first time he said that last one. I was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then I said, "Theo, your grandmother died last month and I needed you at the funeral." That is not energy. That is your family. He didn't come to the next Christmas either. By the time my granddaughter Becca was born, I had met Serena exactly 4 times. At the baby shower, to which I was invited 3 days before, just long enough that I couldn't make travel arrangements, which I suspect was the point. Serena held court at the center of the room while I sat in a corner eating petit fours and talking to a woman named Faye who turned out to be Serena's college roommate and who, in between glasses of champagne, told me that Serena had mentioned that my relationship with Theo was complicated. I drove home to Knoxville that night and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I could go inside. The actual break came on a Sunday in February. Theo called me, which was unusual, and his voice had that careful quality that meant he'd rehearsed what he was going to say. He told me that Serena felt my presence in their lives was causing stress, and that they'd talked to a therapist who had helped them understand the importance of protecting their family unit. He said they needed space. He said he hoped I'd understand. I asked how much space. He said, "We'll reach out when we're ready." That was 11 years ago. I did not hear my son's voice for 11 years. I'm not going to spend too long on those years because they were what they were, and I survived them. And surviving them made me who I am now. What I will tell you is this. I cried exactly once in Conrad's bathroom the night after the call. I sat on the tile floor with my back against the tub, and I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I washed my face, looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, and made a decision. I was not going to wait. I was 62 years old, freshly estranged from my only child, with a modest savings account and a skill set that was valuable if I used it right. So I started using it right. I spent the next 18 months flipping houses in Knoxville, Not the glamorous kind you see on TV. The unglamorous kind, the ones with water damage and bad wiring and yards full of kudzu. I bought cheap, fixed them myself, sold them for enough to buy 2 more, then 4. I had the knowledge. I'd been building other people's wealth for 30 years. It was time to build my own. By year 4, I had a small portfolio of rental properties in East Tennessee and a partnership with a property management company that handled the day-to-day. By year 7, I had diversified into commercial, small strip malls, a self-storage facility in Maryville, a medical office building near UT's campus that I will tell you turned out to be the best decision I ever made in my life, financially speaking. I moved to Asheville not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I had always loved the mountains, and I had always wanted a porch where I could sit and watch the weather come in over the ridge. The Craftsman on 3 acres gave me exactly that. I planted a garden. I learned to make bread. I took a woodworking class at the Community Arts Center and started building furniture in my garage. Nothing you'd put in a magazine, but solid, real, made with my own hands. I was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely at peace. My neighbor on the left, an older man named Harold who had retired from the Forest Service, took to walking over most evenings around 5 o'clock. We'd sit on the porch and drink whatever was cold and watch the light change on the mountains and not say much. Harold was the kind of company that doesn't demand anything from you. I value that in a person. It was Harold, in fact, who first told me what was coming. He'd been in town at the hardware store and had run into a woman he knew from the local historical society. She mentioned, making conversation, that she'd heard someone was asking around about me, not by name exactly, but asking the kind of questions that add up. That contractor who moved here a few years back, the one on the old Burnett property, and describing me accurately enough that Harold knew exactly who they meant. I thanked him and went inside and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I thought. There are only a handful of people who could be asking about me in Asheville. Most of them I'd left no reason to look. There was one exception. 3 days later, my cell phone rang. The number was a North Carolina area code I didn't recognize. I let it ring. They left a voicemail. I sat with my hand on the phone for a moment before I played it. Theo's voice. Still the same voice, but older. He said he'd been trying to track me down. He said he'd heard I was doing well. He said, and this was the part that took me a moment to process, that he and his family were going through some transitions and that he'd really like to reconnect. He said Becca, who was now 12, had been asking about her grandfather. He said he missed me. I played the message 3 times. The first time I felt something open up in my chest, that old ache, the one that never fully closed. The second time I listened for what wasn't being said. The third time I started to understand the shape of what was happening. I called my attorney that same afternoon. Her name is Vivienne. She's been my attorney for 6 years, and she is the kind of woman who asks exactly the right questions without any sentiment getting in the way. I told her about the voicemail. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't call him back yet. Let's find out what's going on first." She knew a private investigator in Charlotte. Within 2 weeks, I had a very clear picture. Theo's commercial real estate career, which I had heard about secondhand over the years through the occasional relative who still spoke to both of us, had collapsed. He'd made a series of bad investments during the market correction, leveraged too heavily on 2 properties that went underwater, and was now looking at approximately $400,000 in debt and a pending lawsuit from a former business partner. His and Serena's house in the Ballantine area of Charlotte was over-mortgaged. Their lifestyle, private school for Becca, a car payment on a vehicle that cost more than my first 3 houses combined, a vacation membership they apparently hadn't used in 2 years, was entirely funded on credit that was now being called in. Serena, according to the investigator's report, had been the one pushing to find me. I read the report twice. Then I made myself dinner. Pork tenderloin, roasted sweet potatoes, a salad from my garden, and I sat on the porch in the dark and thought about Becca. 12 years old. Not her fault. Not her doing. A child who had grown up not knowing her grandfather because 2 adults had decided that was fine. I thought about that for a long time. Then I called Vivienne back and told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is either very gracious or very smart." I said, "It's both." I called Dio back the next day. I kept my voice neutral, warm but not eager. He sounded relieved. which told me everything I needed to know about how worried he'd been that I might not answer. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me things were a little complicated right now, but that he'd love for me to meet Becca properly, that she'd been asking about me, that maybe I could come down to Charlotte or they could come up. I said I'd love to have them come up. I had plenty of space. What I did not say was that Vivienne had already drafted the relevant paperwork. What I did not say was that I had spent the previous week documenting every asset I owned in a way that made certain none of it was reachable by a judgment creditor through a family member. What I did not say was that the property management company had been formally separated from my personal holdings 2 weeks before Theo's voicemail, on my attorney's existing advice, in a restructuring that had been planned for tax purposes, but that now served an additional function. I had worked too hard. I was not going to hand it over, because my son had finally run out of other options. But I did want to see Becca. That part was real. They arrived on a Saturday in late September. Theo drove a leased BMW that I recognized from the investigator's report. Serena got out of the passenger side, looking the same as I remembered, but carrying something in her face that hadn't been there before. A careful brightness, the kind people wear when they're working very hard to seem at ease. Becca got out of the back seat and stopped and looked at the house and the mountains and the garden, and then looked at me. She had Theo's eyes, my mother's cheekbones. I said, "You must be Becca." She said, "You're taller than I thought." I said, "People say that." She almost smiled. Bunch was careful. Theo complimented the house repeatedly and in the specific way that meant he was assessing it. Serena asked several questions about the property that were dressed up as curiosity but were structured like appraisals. How many acres? How long have you owned it? Did you do the renovation yourself? I answered honestly and briefly and watched her process the answers. After lunch, Becca asked if she could see the garden. I took her out while Theo and Serena stayed inside with their coffee. We walked the rows, tomatoes still coming in, butternut squash, late-season beans, and she asked good questions. She wanted to know how I knew when something was ready to pick. I told her you learn by paying attention, by being present with it, by not assuming you know until you actually check. She said, "That sounds like a lot of things." I said, "It is." We came back inside to find Theo and Serena at the kitchen table with a folder I had not left there. My stomach went still. Serena had gone through my filing cabinet. The folder contained what she probably thought were the deeds to my properties. They were not. They were copies. Exactly the kind of copies an organized person might file, containing no information that wasn't already public record. Vivienne told me to make sure that anything with real teeth was in the safe deposit box in town. Everything here was what you'd expect a 63-year-old homeowner to have. Nothing more. But the fact that she looked told me everything. Theo saw my face and started talking quickly. He said they weren't snooping, that Serena had just been looking for a pen, that the folder had just been there. Serena did not look embarrassed. She looked like someone recalibrating. I sat down at the table. I put my hands flat on the surface the way I used to do in job site meetings when something needed to be settled. I looked at my son. I said, "Theo, I love you. I think I will always love you, and nothing that has happened changes that. But I need you to tell me the truth right now about why you're here. Not the version you prepared. The actual reason." There was a long silence. Serena started to speak. I held up one hand without looking at her. I said, "I'm talking to my son." Theo looked at his hands. Then he told me. The debt, the lawsuit, the house, the fact that they'd had a conversation. He used the word discussion, but I heard the real word, which was argument, about whether his father, whom he had cut out of his life for 11 years without a real reason, might be willing to help. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "What exactly are you asking me for?" He said they were thinking about relocating. Simplifying. He said the house in Charlotte was probably going to have to go. He said Becca needed stability. He said if there was space here, just temporarily, just while they got back on their feet. Serena said, "You have 4 bedrooms." I looked at her then. She met my eyes without flinching, which I will give her. She is not a coward. She is just a person who had spent 11 years treating me like I didn't exist and now needed something from me. I said, "I'm aware of how many bedrooms I have." Theo said my name. I stood up and went to the kitchen counter and refilled my coffee. I took my time with it. I could feel the three of them watching me. Theo anxious, Serena calculating, Becca quiet. In the corner where she'd sat back down, looking out the window at the mountains the way she had when we first arrived. I said, Becca, would you be willing to go sit on the back porch for a few minutes? I want to talk to your parents. She looked at me. Something passed between us. I don't know how to describe it exactly, except that she reminded me in that moment of myself at her age, the way you learn to read a room before you're old enough to name what you're doing. She got up without a word and went to the back porch, pulling the door gently behind her. I turned to Theo and Serena. I said, you want to move in here? I want to make sure I understand. Theo started to say something about it only being temporary. I let him finish. Then I said, I'm not going to do that. Serena said, we're family. I said, that's correct. We are family. We were family 11 years ago, too, and 9 years ago, and 6 years ago when I sent Becca a birthday card for the first time and got no response. We were family all of that time. And you made a decision about what that was worth. Theo said, Dad. I said, I'm not angry, Theo. I'm really not. I'm telling you what's true. You made choices that had consequences, and now there are different consequences. And I think on some level you understand that I'm not obligated to make those consequences disappear. Serena said, so you're going to punish him, your own son. I said, I'm not punishing anyone. You're adults who made decisions. I'm an adult making a different one. She said, what about Becca? And here I want to be careful, because I had thought about this a great deal in the weeks before they came. I want you to understand that what I did next was not done out of cruelty. It was done out of something more complicated and more considered than that. I said, I would like Becca to come and stay with me. For the school year. If she's willing, and if you'll allow it. There's a good middle school 5 minutes from here. She'd have her own room, the garden, the mountains. She'd have her grandfather who was actually present, and you would have the time and space to deal with your situation without a 12-year-old watching you do it. Serena stared at me. Theo looked like I had said something in a language he needed a moment to translate. I said, think about it. Talk to her. If she wants to come, I'll have Vivienne draw up a temporary guardianship agreement. Nothing permanent, just a formal arrangement so everyone's protected. If she doesn't want to come, I understand. And I'll stay in touch in whatever way she's comfortable with. Serena said, you want to take our daughter. I said, I want your daughter to have a stable place to live while you handle what you need to handle. That's different. There was a long silence. Theo got up and went to the back porch. I watched through the kitchen window as he sat next to Becca and talked to her. She listened. He talked for a while. She looked at the mountains and then back at him and said something I couldn't hear. He came back inside. He said, she wants to stay. Serena made a sound I don't know how to describe in writing. Then she picked up her bag and walked outside to the car. Theo stood in my kitchen looking at me with an expression that was layered in ways I didn't try to fully read. Guilt and relief, and something older underneath it. Something that might have been, someday, a beginning. I said, you can call her every day. You can visit whenever you want to, as long as it's planned in advance. I'm not keeping her from you. I'm just giving her a floor to stand on. He said, I know. I said, and Theo, when you've dealt with what you need to deal with, the debt, the legal situation, all of it, if you want to have a real conversation, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded. He looked like he might say something more, but he didn't. He went to find Serena, and they drove away in the leased BMW, down my long driveway, out through the trees. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I went to the back porch. Becca was still sitting where Theo had left her. She was looking out at the ridge, where the afternoon light was going gold and low through the oaks. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, and her chin resting on them, and she looked, in that moment, very young and very old at the same time. I sat in the other chair. After a while, she said, Are they mad? I said, A little. They'll be okay. She said, Are you sure? I said, I'm sure enough. She looked at me then. She said, Why did you want me to stay? You don't even know me. I thought about that for a moment. I wanted to give her the true answer, not the easy one. I said, I know you a little. I watched you in the garden today. You paid attention. You didn't pretend to know things you didn't know. And when I told you to give us some space, You went without making it harder than it had to be. That tells me something about who you are." She was quiet. I said, "Also, you're my granddaughter. I lost 11 years I should have had with you. I'd rather not lose any more." She thought about this for what felt like a full minute. Then she said, "I don't really know how to do a garden." I said, "You'll learn. It takes attention, mostly." She said, "You said that already." I said, "It's true twice." The corner of her mouth moved. We sat there until the sun dropped behind the ridge, and the air went cool, and the first stars came out over the mountains. I got up eventually and went inside to start dinner, and she followed me, and she stood at the counter and watched while I showed her how to peel a sweet potato without taking off half the flesh with it. And she was bad at it at first, which was exactly right, and she laughed a little at herself, which told me everything I needed to know. There is a bedroom at the end of the hall that gets the morning light. I put her in it that first night, and she was asleep before I'd finished saying goodnight. I went back to the porch and sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about my father working that mill in Spartanburg until his back gave out. I thought about all the houses I'd built for other people. I thought about the pull-out couch in Conrad's basement, and the gas station sandwiches, and the 20 minutes I'd sat in my driveway, unable to go inside. I thought about 11 years of silence and what a person does with that kind of weight. And then I thought about a 12-year-old girl in the room at the end of the hall, sleeping in the mountains for the first time in her life, not knowing yet that she was going to be okay. She enrolled in school the following Monday. By October, she had a friend named Petra she walked home with on Tuesdays. By November, she had claimed a corner of the garden as her own and planted garlic for spring. She called her parents every Sunday evening, and I gave her privacy for those calls, and I didn't ask what they talked about. She was, it turned out, very good at paying attention. Vivienne finalized the temporary guardianship in early November. I had been prepared for Serena to contest it. She didn't. I don't know what Theo said to her, or what she had decided for herself. I only know that the papers were signed, and the arrangement was legal, and Becca was here, in the room with the morning light, planting garlic, walking home with Petra on Tuesdays. Theo called me in December, not about Becca, just to talk. We talked for an hour. It was halting in places, and careful, and there were things neither of us said that we will probably say eventually, when we're ready. But it was real. It was his own voice, not the rehearsed version. And at the end he said, "Thank you, Dad," in a way that I understood had more than one meaning. I said, "Take care of yourself, son." And I meant it. The bread I baked the morning after they first left came out better than any batch I'd made before. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd finally stopped holding something I'd been carrying for 11 years, and my hands were lighter for it. I put a loaf on Harold's porch that afternoon, wrapped in a dish towel the way my mother used to do. He knocked on my door that evening to return the towel, and he stood on my porch and looked at the mountains going dark and said, "Sounds like you had a big week." I said, "Yeah, I did." He nodded like that was enough, which it was, and went back to his own porch. The mountains didn't say anything at all. They never do. But they were there, the same as always, and so was I. I've thought a lot about the word deserve since that September afternoon. People use it in both directions. I deserved better, and they got what they deserved. And I'm not sure either framing gets at the truth of what actually happens between people over time. What I know is this. The life I have now is a direct result of choices I made when I had nothing but time and a skill I'd spent 30 years giving to other people. I could have spent those years in Conrad's basement being bitter. I almost did, but somewhere in that first winter, I made a decision that bitterness is just grief that forgot to move. I let the grief be what it was, and then I made myself get up and work. That's not a story about karma. It's a story about what happens when you stop waiting for someone else to restore what you've lost, and you build it yourself instead. I didn't get my mountain house because the universe owed me. I got it because I showed up every day and made decisions that compounded over time. The same way a garden does, the same way trust does, the same way any real thing does. Theo made choices that reflected who he was at the time. A man who hadn't yet learned that the people who shaped you are not obstacles to your future. Serena made choices that reflected her fear of not having enough, of not being in control. I'm not excusing either of them, but I understand them better now than I did when I was sitting on Conrad's bathroom floor. What I couldn't have told you then, but can tell you now, is that the hardest thing about the years of silence wasn't the silence itself. It was staying decent through it, continuing to be a person I could respect, not letting the wound turn me into someone sharp and closed. That took something. I don't have a clean word for it. It's part stubbornness and part self-respect and part the simple refusal to let someone else's choices determine who you become. Becca, without knowing it, is teaching me something new about all of this. She is 12 years old and she already knows how to be present with something without needing to control it. She'll stand in the garden for 20 minutes just watching a tomato plant, checking the soil, noticing what she notices. She doesn't pretend to know things she doesn't know yet. That kind of honesty is rarer in adults than it should be. I think about what I want to pass on to her. Not money. She'll figure out her own relationship with that. What I want her to have is the understanding that who you are in the hard years is the foundation for everything that comes after. That real intelligence isn't just about knowing things. It's about knowing what you don't know and being willing to learn it. That the people who come out the other side of difficult times with their character intact, not perfect, just honest and still trying, those are the people worth becoming. I planted that garlic with her in November. In spring, it'll come up whether we're watching for it or not. That's the thing about doing something right. It doesn't need you to keep justifying it. It just grows,